Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock,
What happens when the world doesn't want the protection of its superheroes? That's basically the question that Watchmen asks in the original movie that was done back in 2009 with Zach Snyder, and then most recently an HBO series by Damon Lindelof, who was one of the main writers, creators of Lost. I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds.
Hi there, sponsored by Hydroponics this week.
And the thing that I felt like a question that kind of came up for me was how it's interesting how you can have pretty much all the right ingredients and stuff, and yet somehow I feel like it can, with remakes and in particular, and still like kind of really, it can just fall flat. I mean, that's really what it comes down to something. That, like, in other words, I feel like you can have like the right stars, the right budget, the right writing and all that kind of stuff, but it can really, in the end, still not really kind of hit that certain note, I feel like, that we've seen with some remakes, and then others that just, again, just really don't quite hit the mark.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're talking in terms of this, in terms of adaptation, then, I mean, it depends on the source material, can be very much written solely to be absorbed or taken in its original form. Like the Watchmen graphic novel was often touted as being unadaptable. And likewise, there's some movies that simply work better as movies rather than TV shows, or they're just so right for that time. Well, I mean, we've done millions of examples of movies that work in their times that don't work anymore. But yeah, I mean, it's especially when you're working with something that's really specifically intended to be, taken in by its audience in a particular format. And when you have a person who actually doesn't like TV and movie and specifically makes their thing not to be adapted, that makes it that much more difficult. But original nonetheless. But
I think the other thing that kind of happens sometimes is, where, these paint by numbers kind of, remakes, I think or versions, adaptations, stuff like that. It really just kind of, even if it's like kind of true to form to the source material, and then, for that matter, especially remakes and stuff like that, I think what happens is that, like, it doesn't capture, like, never mind the whole lightning in the bottle kind of thing, but it also doesn't capture like the energy or like kind of what the intent of the original creators, and like, in other words, here we have Alan Moore, who, like like you said, writes very much for comics / graphic novels and stuff, and his writing, you can kind of really see how, like, there's just something about the way he approaches it that it just like kind of fits these kind of panels and stuff like that. And then if you try to just do shot by shot and stuff, then the movie kind of feels like it's a comic that's like trying to be a movie and stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's one of the interesting things about the Watchmen movie, is that it's incredibly faithful in some respects to the original, but it doesn't seem to kind of bring across the same intent of the graphic novel somehow. Right. Which was interesting because, I mean, this week what we did was actually both of us read the graphic novel, all sorts of hundreds of pages of it, which is something we don't always do. But no. I insisted that John read it because I thought it's worthwhile reading. But I mean, I think a bit of background on that is that, this is 1985 it was written, and this was kind of late 80s. There was a very much kind of, people weren't really into your traditional heroes that were goodies, and, we had Alien and Predator, Terminator and Robocop as like the predominant sort of sci-fi. So, and this was also when you got the kind of the rise of more serious comics or graphic novels like, Clive Barker and Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore all writing these sort of quite sort of challenging comics that were subverting a lot of people's expectations and veering into new territory that hadn't been done before. So and I mean, this Watchmen was really written as a complete kind of satire and a way of subverting all your expectations about superhero comics. In particular, kind of Steve Ditko's Charlton Comics characters, which he viewed as very objectivist. And if you want a kind of a shorthand for that, think Khan in Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan, i.e. the superior intellect is the one that should rule, or the superior sort of being is the one that should be in charge. So that was kind of how it was written. And you can kind of see that in all of the characters. They absolutely feel they're completely justified in their actions, but they're all kind of sociopaths or generally unlikable characters. And it's sort of up to you as to how you interpret it. And there's no real clear cut morality with a lot of them. They're all very human characters, which is this other sort of message of, if superheroes were really human, it probably wouldn't be that great. Fundamentally, it wouldn't be that brilliant an idea. So,
yeah, I mean that is definitely one of the key ideas I think that comes across in the different versions, is this idea that, like, I mean, you can have, like, these superpowers, and for the most part, like in the case of the original Watchmen and the Minutemen, who were like the predecessors, these were just regular people that put on costumes. And in fact, they even called them costume adventurers or costume heroes and stuff like that. Yeah. Versus, like, whereas I think in the general comics, the Superman, so on and so forth, it's really only Batman and a few other ones that, like, was just, regular human being with, kind of powers through wearing, the costume or having devices and stuff like that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think Batman is a really good one for this, because the ultimate sort of subversive thing about Watchmen is that there aren't actually any real superheroes except for one, which is Dr. Manhattan.
Right.
And all the other superheroes are kind of like weird inversions of Batman, in that Rohrshach is, he's penniless and sort of like slightly insane, but he's still kind of a detective who fights crime at night, very much like Batman.
Right.
Night Owl is kind of like very wealthy like Batman, but is totally insecure and hasn't got the courage or the will to actually go out and fight crime. Right. And then you've kind of got Adrian Veidt as the closest one, but he just does everything in such a sort of nasty, manipulative, duplicitous sort of stabbing in the back method that it's completely unlike Batman. And of course, Dr. Manhattan is the only one with real superpowers, but he's so godlike in them that you can't relate to him as a character. Right. And because he sort of perceives time and space in such a sort of fragmented and sort of holistic manner, he's almost completely incomprehensible and totally unrelatable as a character, which is done on purpose and is really effective, in my opinion.
Yeah, and in fact, he's really, also shown as a character who, because he has such powers that he's like, has a hard time relating to us as human beings and stuff. And so because of that, it makes it where, like, it's pretty almost arbitrary the times that he decides to get involved, and where other times he's like simply saying, oh, well, I didn't do that. Like, in other words, when somebody, wants him to kind of, save, some group or say, something, whatever, his response may be like, like, oh, I didn't do that. Like, in other words, because, like you said, he's looking at the whole, he's seeing time or experiencing time in like a very different thing of like everything's happening all at once kind of thing, like the multiverses kind of thing. All he's seeing different times, like the fact that, like, because he did do it, like in any kind of time or any universe, therefore he's not going to do it because he just so it's kind of really
it's been preordained for him not to help those people or something like this weird. But then again, he's quite hypocritical because he still seems to take an interest in beautiful women and things like this. Even though he's sort of on one hand saying, oh, I've got so little in common with human beings and I don't really want anything to do with them, but yet he still kind of like does that. So yeah, I mean, it's quite a funny character, really.
And like one of the big kind of in your face kind of things about him is the fact that, like, a lot of times in these comics, right, because they're PG or whatever, the characters are shown as kind of almost neutered, and here he's got his big kind of genitals kind of splitting and stuff like that. So it's kind of weird. On the one hand, he's physically displaying his kind of manhood, but on the other, he's emotionally like very much celibate and stuff.
And I think that it's that sort of level of adult interaction in relationships, the reality of people losing their minds, are all sort of things you just never seen in comics at that point, and especially not a large blue naked man everywhere.
Right.
So, there was one of those things that you're just like, but why is he naked? And then it's kind of explained that, he just doesn't care about anything anymore. Right. He's way beyond that. So, it's pretty funny. And I think that there's the two real kind of philosophies though of the story are, you've got Rohrshach, who is, if it's a story of kind of like, do the ends justify the means? So with Adrian Veidt, the ends, it doesn't matter what you do before that, whatever horrific things you do, as long as you have peace on earth, then whatever. Whereas Rohrshach is the complete opposite. It's like every sort of thing has to be met face on, and there has to be an absolute moral kind of judgment on it. Hence why his mask is black and white. He's looking for that black and white absolute morality in everything he does. And you can see, and that's part of his flawed kind of character as well, because he, as well as seeing, crime must be kind of punished and punished really violently, but also sort of, homosexuals are evil and deviant sexuality is wrong. And, he's a very kind of right-wing kind of character in that respect.
Well, it's right-wing, but also like where, whereas it's black and white, but it's a constantly shifting black and white too. So that's kind of what makes it even more like kind of confusing, I guess, in some ways. He does see things, like you said, in right and wrong, but that right and wrong is almost like, seems like almost moment by moment, kind of like, almost arbitrary in some ways.
Yeah, and I think this is such a clever thing with the visual use of his mask in the story, and that, everything he does is, he says, well, there's just oblivion, and you can interpret it any way you can, much like a Rorschach pattern, which I thought was really, really clever. But what's interesting about it is when you're actually reading it, you do end up identifying more with Rorschach than you would with any of the other characters. And I think that kind of goes to this. I've been reading the Bushido, the book of story of Bushido, and it's all about sort of honor and the sort of the code of samurai. And in some respects, Rorschach kind of follows that, in that he doesn't, one of their sayings is you fight battles with iron, not gold. And that's exactly what he does. He sort of confronts everything and he sticks to his principles, and he kind of like does that. So in some respects, even though he's this sort of slightly unhinged character, you still kind of identify him, because at least he's very consistent and kind of does things from a, he follows a path of kind of rectitude, you would say, which others don't.
Yeah, and here we have like just to kind of mention briefly some of the actors and stuff like that. Jackie Earle Haley playing Rohrshach, who actually will be seeing him in some future episode of Bad News Bears, but also he was in turns out in the kind of the future of this movie and stuff like that he's in the Robocop remake as the villain and stuff like that. So so it's interesting kind of see him, like, in fact, one of the things I thought was interesting is that he basically fought to get the role because he really was a fan of the comic as well, and then also like he just gravitated towards that particular role.
Yeah, why not? I mean, he's a fascinating character. There's no doubt about it, albeit flawed. I mean, God, who wouldn't want to be in it, really? I mean, so I mean, I would say the difference, what I kind of didn't like in the movie, as we're on the subject of Rorschach, is that he wasn't quite enough of a psycho, and he wasn't quite extreme enough. Because in the comics, he comes across as much more kind of extreme and unrelenting. And I didn't really feel like, and I didn't feel that he actually got enough screen time maybe to do that. I don't, but that was my overriding impression. But they are very faithful with a lot of the scenes. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think where you're kind of maybe driving, Matt, is that kind of where one of the things that's kind of difficult in movies is like, having, like, there's only so much voiceover that people can tolerate and stuff, and I think that's one of the things that like is a challenge. And Rohrshach, for the most part in the comics, we're kind of seeing everything from his journal and how he's like kind of basically walking through the cities, and I think that's the thing that visually in a movie, like they did faithfully do a lot of that, but I think it's really hard to sustain because of the fact that, like, there's only so much that people will tolerate of a voiceover and everything. And, you know, as it is, like the movie, like it clocks in like, you know, at about 3 hours, you know, like kind of,
yeah.
and then 3.5 with the pirates. Like, and from what I remember, and I have to ask you, I don't remember the pirate scenes, you know, that whole story being in the original movie, like when in the theater
No.
anyway.
Yeah, no, I mean, there was the theatrical cut that was already kind of shortened.
Okay.
There was the director's cut, which was longer. I think it was like 3 hours 20. But that still didn't include any of the Black Tales from the Black Freighter. And then they released Tales from the Black Freighter separately as a kind of a side piece. And then the ultimate cut is it all kind of interweaved.
Yeah.
But I think I think Zach Snyder's sort of said that the director's cut is how he wanted the flow of the movie to go. And people tend to say that that interjecting the Black Freighter bits does kind of break up the movie a bit too much. I mean, it's used in a much more different way in the comic, in that he's alluding to the people, the newspaper man and the kid reading the comic. They're there to sort of say, you know, if you're getting lost in the news and the fear, you know, it's the same as losing yourself in fantasy in a way. And they're trying to draw that kind of parallel. I kind of felt, and it's done in this very sort of interweaving narrative way with what's happening. The Black Freighter kind of happens, and to a lesser extent to these people's sort of social interactions, which I thought was, you know, it's the kind of thing that only really works in a comic kind of thing. And actually, I think Zack Snyder should have left it out, really, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, though, that like you said, where it kind of makes more sense with the way that, like in a comic panel, you can kind of see the dialogue happening with the Black Freighter at the same time as what you're seeing with the people, versus like overall context of, like, you know, the story and stuff like that, because that's, you know, kind of what's all happening at once. But I think, you know, visually, it's really hard to just, you know, cut all those things together and not like kind of really lose people and stuff like that.
Yeah. And that seems to be from reading reviews and people's comments on it, that seems to be their overriding impression. Yeah. And it's already the story with Dr. Manhattan is already broken up into all sorts of different strains already. Right. It's already hard to follow anything relating where he's coming into it, because his story jumps from different time periods, different locations. It's on Mars, then it's back in a lab. And I mean, this was an incredibly clever device in the novel, in the comic, I should say, because it was storytelling in a very new kind of way. But also, I kind of feel that this was, you know, consider it was written in 1985. This is almost like a precursor of how we live our lives with the internet.
Right. That's true.
We now have access to information from any time period, any location. Yeah. And so there's this weird sort of, you know, mystical foresight there, I think, with Dr. Manhattan.
Like, in terms of the Black Freighter story itself, though, what for you, like, is the connection to the overall, like, Watchmen story, though?
Well, I mean, for me, it's you know, the Black Freighter is a tale of someone who's sort of traumatized and is trying to sort of find their way back to normality. And then when they think they've found what they think of as how they perceive their past and a nostalgic thing, they actually destroy it. Yeah. And that's kind of similar with a lot of the characters in Watchmen, in that a lot of them, like Night Owl, Silk Spector, they often have this, and you know, there's the perfume nostalgia, which is there to sort of it's less featured in the movie, but you know, it's when Silk Spector's talking about the original Silk Spector's talking about the comedian, when she sort of has that resolution with her daughter, she says, there's this overriding smell of it's nostalgia, you know. And it's kind of a lot of them, that sort of traumatic pasts kind of coming back and thinking they can reckon with it in a way. And I think, you know, the whole comedian Silk Spector storyline is represented in this way that, you know, she's very much looking through rose-tinted glasses at what's happened to her, and is kind of trying to sort of, you know, see it through an overly glamorized and nostalgic lens. But I mean, really, the comedian was totally abusive and a psychopath, you know.
Yeah, I guess, you know, again, as always, major spoiler that like
Sorry, yeah.
as it turns out that the comedians, the the dad of kind of the new Silk Spector, who's played by Laurie, or as Laurie, who's played by Malin Akerman and stuff. And I think for her, she's got to resolve the fact that like the guy who tried to rape his mother is also her father and stuff. And I think for her, it's kind of just fighting the anger or stuff like that. But then meanwhile, like you said, the mother, starts off like kind of being kind of jaded, bitter, but then almost like towards the end, like kind of because how after they reconcile, that then she almost has to shape it as like, oh, but he wasn't really that bad and stuff like that. Like in a way that like she had to like you said, that's why she had to like have the rose-colored glasses, because it's this human nature thing of like we have to like somehow reconcile that like that like we wouldn't end up with a a bastard and stuff like that, so therefore he couldn't be that bad. I mean I ended up producing this daughter and stuff.
Yeah, I mean that's a weird sort of part in the Zach Snyder movie, that because there's almost this line that it's okay because he gave me you. That isn't really the sentiment in the comic. It's more sort of like, well, there's all this terrible stuff going on, and we've just kind of got to get on with our lives, and we've got each other is more the kind of sentiment. Yeah, it's a subtle difference, but it's one that. Yeah.
At the same time, though, like what was though in the original comic though was this idea of like that like in the end when like the decision for Dr. Manhattan to intervene in that is like comes down to that like he finally recognizes that like in Laurie was this kind of thermonuclear miracle and stuff like that. So in other words, that like that even this being who is omniscient and all powerful, stuff like that, did see like kind of the miracle, if you will, of that came out of like something that wasn't maybe as pretty or as kind of great in different ways, but in the end though, so I guess what's funny is going back to this idea, like, does the end justify the means? Well, here's like a life that was created from a less than ideal kind of means and stuff. So yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, you have to say, Dr. Manhattan's sort of way of looking at that is very original and a very sort of optimistic and hopeful kind of view of this kind of thing, that you can resolve these things, and there is something to be said for being able to come through this kind of stuff. It's pretty interesting. Certainly interesting to see that in the comic. Certainly in 1985, but yeah. And I kind of feel in a way though that they did a bit of a disservice to the new Silk Spector, in that she has so much more dialogue in the comic, and you get so much more insight into her character, and there's a lot more complexity. And I kind of felt like Malin Akerman, I don't know if it was a result of direction or performance or just the lack of lines, more or less, but she felt like a very kind of even keel character. In the novel, she's much more concerned about what's going on. She hates the fact that she's living in this army base and is being surveilled all the time, and is kind of this complete frustration with Dr. Manhattan. I kind of feel like she's one of the characters that gets shortchanged a little bit in this movie.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good, interesting question. We're gonna definitely look at her again in some other roles. In particular, the one that comes to mind is Heartbreak Kid and everything. And like overall, my sense of her as an actress is that like she has some ability, but like it's I almost feel like she does have a kind of relatively limited range, and I think that may be like kind of a little bit of what's reflected. But at the same time, like, I'm wondering if, like, how many chances does she get to, like, because sometimes it goes back to this thing that we've talked about before, that, like, with some of the actors, because they're attractive, then they're just kind of like almost assumed that, like, that's why they get the roles and stuff. So like, somebody like Chris Evans doing a stretch into Snowpiercer is, like, such a little bit of surprise / like, kind of also, like, where I think they have to, like, push not only themselves, but also, like, all the other powers that be to kind of like, give them a shot and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think she just doesn't come across as human as she does in the novel.
Yeah.
But, I mean, there's, I mean, if we're talking about how the characters are represented in the movie, Night Owl is a lot more insecure and pathetic in the novel and in the comic
definitely.
than he is in the movie. And for me, that's a bit of a shame that they made him that way in the movie, because that's part of the humor of the original comic is, he is so pathetic, and the fact that they go through all this stuff to do a prison break, and he's already escaped, and then they're talking about a time when he had to go to the bathroom and he was on a mission. They missed all of these kind of humorous bits in the movie. And likewise, when they finally sort of decide to break out and save the people from the fire, they're there sort of, you don't really see them doing much other than serving them coffee. There's no real heroic frames.
Yeah, they totally cut that out. Yeah.
All these sort of like complete sort of funny subversions of what you expect from a superhero movie.
And I wonder, certainly it's clearly a good part, the Zach Snyder's choice and stuff like that. I think the other part too is that like we're just wanting just even the choice of Patrick Wilson, I guess, for the actor and stuff. He definitely comes across as more manly, because in the comic or the graphic novel, the Night Owl is, I want to say he's almost got this kind of dad, kind of body and stuff like that, where a little bit of gut and all that kind of goes away with when you have like a actor that just seems like more just simply like where I feel it's more like kind of the Clark Kent thing where by putting on some glasses, he's therefore not recognizable as this, superhero, right, and stuff like that. Whereas, meanwhile, he's still got these muscles, and he's still kind of, got the build and everything like that.
Yeah, and it was just all the kind of the superhero fighting scenes that just went, it kind of undermines, it makes this whole idea of it being a satire a bit of a half measure, because by making them heroic, you were kind of taking away from the original point. Ideally, you want to make all the heroes completely dysfunctional and useless, and you want to make Dr. Manhattan as godlike as possible. But having said that, I think this is the thing which I think is, in a way, you should almost view the Watchmen movie like a fan movie made about the novel, about the comic, because it's so much more satisfying if you're a fan of the comic going into it, because it's just nice to be able to see someone really sort of beautifully portray these scenes that you've seen. Like, Dr. Manhattan's sort of backstory is really quite amazingly done, I think, in the movie. It's really visualized in a nice way. And I mean, for all the Snyder slow-mo in the movie, his trademark, it's really effective, I mean, it's really amazing to watch.
Yeah, so, in just a matter of a few minutes, they really kind of do a nice kind of package of the overall story and stuff like that, of his transformation and stuff. I mean, I do feel like you really not only get the sense of what happened and stuff, but also like it's like kind of just it's probably one of those most memorable sequences of any kind of superhero origin story and stuff.
Totally. And for me, the other scene that's really, really great is actually the opening scene played to Bob Dylan, The Times Are Changing, where he's got all these pop culture references and he's replaced them with superheroes. For me, that was a really, really cool scene, and actually gets you really excited for the movie, but I don't think the rest of the movie kind of lives up to that, unfortunately. But it is really cool.
And that says a lot too, because usually, your thing is that like you don't really care for these credit kind of slash sequences and stuff. So.
I know, yeah. Well, I think it was done in such a creative way. Normally, it's just like information sort of download, whereas this is kind of like they've got Andy Warhol doing Night Owl and Silhouette, kind of like kissing, a girl after the wars. And stuff like this, there's lots of really interesting touches, and it's a really cool scene. There's no doubt about it.
And I guess that's definitely a great segue into like a key part of Watchmen is the idea of this alternate history that while in fact that has to be one of the things that really drew me to the series, because I was not really familiar with the graphic novel until really kind of doing this, that I went back into it, because I'd seen it on the shelf and all that kind of stuff. But for me, the entryway was the movie and stuff. And again, while the movie was in a lot of ways, like kind of, it did a lot of things well. It was that alternate history that kind of drew me, and then in the end though, that like, I was like, oh, okay, it was interesting, stuff like that. But I feel like that was like kind of, on the one hand, like kind of really what fascinated me, but then the rest of the movie didn't really do more with it, I guess. It just kind of like you said, it had the sequence, and I was like, wow, that's kind of cool, stuff like that. But then it kind of just left it at that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the thing that was missing, there was no 80s music most of the way through it, which is a big thing that missed. They did recreate the Doctor Strangelove kind of set for the government meetings though in the war room.
Right.
But so that was nice to see. Nice that there's those sort of pop culture references. But yeah, it didn't do it enough, I would say. That's part of the appeal of the comic. But I mean, the other thing that's kind of one criticism of Zack Snyder is that he has these sort of fairly conservative sort of values that he sort of brings in, or there's this criticism that he takes sort of left-leaning stories and makes them more sort of conservative, which I think is quite interesting. And there is like a few little snippets that I can point out, like when Rohrshach is being interviewed by the psychiatrist, he says, oh, why don't you like me? And in the novel, he says, oh, it's because you're fat and you're rich and you don't understand pain. Whereas in the movie, it's you're fat and you're rich and you have liberal tendencies, which I thought was kind of a weird change. Right. And also kind of like the Adrian Veidt is, he's totally against fossil fuels and wants sort of global peace. But, he is the bad guy after all. So it's, that was kind of I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I mean, they do talk about him sort of inventing new energy things, but it's not quite as on the nose of I'm against fossil fuels like it is in the movie. So yeah, subtle things, but I don't know. I can really say that it's a super right-wing conservative retranslation of it because it's so faithful in lots of other ways. But and likewise, there's lots of characters who are that way.
Well, one major change that, like, which is interesting how we'll see in the series that they kind of kept is the fact that, like, in the movie they got rid of the squid. I mean, that kind of was a really big change, and I'm kind of curious what you think about, like, kind of why that was, like, kind of what the.
Well, for me, there's two things. I mean, again, this is like some of Alan Moore is a practicing magician with a K. And, this was weird in that, he foresaw a big attack on New York that basically, in his story, made everybody kind of come together to fight a common enemy, which in this case was potentially aliens. Well, in the real world, it was not too dissimilar from that. Of course, it wasn't a psychic squid, but, still, I mean, I think trying to do that would be, even in 2009 when this was made, was it 2008, 2009? 2009. It may still have been a bit too soon for something like that. But the other interesting change is this portrayal of Dr. Manhattan as God or as Jesus, because visually he's portrayed very much like Jesus in that the character often below him, he's kind of floating above them. And there's this clip where one of the news media kind of anchors is saying, well, I was quoted as saying Superman has arrived on Earth, but what I really said was when God has arrived on Earth. And rather than it be, and the whole thing with Dr. Manhattan's power being used to destroy lots of cities is portrayed almost like he has, as God, passed judgment on the people for being warlike. So they've turned something that's a completely external alien threat into an internal kind of threat of someone who's superior to them in a way. So it's almost like portrayed as a judgment from God rather than a weird alien squid invasion, which was, again, it's kind of a little bit of that Snyder Christianity kind of thrown in there as well that he's often accused of as well.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. And where, it's interesting because, like, until, that idea came up, I hadn't really thought about how, like, it definitely has a more, conservative leaning towards different, interpretations and stuff. Just very, slight things and stuff. And then now, like, as we're talking about it, I definitely comes more to mind that like, like why would you, like kind of have like a more Christ-like figure, right? And why would you like kind of, go more towards like, protesting like kind of liberal views versus like, the fact that like somebody is simply, disagreeable, stuff like that.
Yeah. And I mean, there's less of the kind of the human relationship stuff with Dr. Manhattan. He's more kind of removed from humanity in the movie. But I mean, Snyder does that with various other movies as well. Some will say his portrayal of Superman is, again, it's a kind of like a Christ-like interpretation of his of things. So he likes to sort of delve into mythological and religious themes. Whether he actually does that purposefully or whether he just thinks it's a cool thing to do in movies is hard to say, really. But I don't think he's got some radical Christian agenda. But who knows?
Right. Yeah, I mean that's one of the things that like I think which I almost feel like that's a good segue into the series if you're ready to kind of dive into that because I feel like here we have like as you and I have kind of talked offline in some ways that Damon Lindelof coming off of like Lost and then also the Leftovers and stuff like that, he wanted to only kind of get involved with the project that despite the fact that he is such a fanboy of Watchmen, he only wanted to do it that if he felt like there was really something he wanted to say, and then also it had to be like now, why now? It was the other kind of question he felt like he had to answer and stuff. Yeah. So there's apparently this article from The Atlantic that talked about reparations, the case for reparations and stuff, that really kind of like just caught his attention. And as we see with this series, like it starts off with this massacre in Tulsa in 1921 that really, I have to admit that I didn't know about, at all before this. And I feel like, I feel like, he really just starting off with that really kind of, right away achieved one objective easily, which is like, bring to attention something that like, for the most part has been forgotten by history and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, that's a pretty amazing story in itself. And the article is really interesting as well. And I mean, to sum up for those, maybe we can link it below, but it's essentially saying, we did this for Jewish people after the Holocaust. Why shouldn't we do it for black people? Which seems a pretty fair point, really. Yeah. So it's, And I feel like the other point of the article is that like, partially why, like kind of people are, why it's not been done is because we're not comfortable with it. Like that's what it comes down to. That, like, that we're hesitant to kind of paint ourselves as the bad guys because it's easy to kind of call the Nazis or whoever else as the kind of the villains and stuff. But we like to be the heroes of our own story. And I feel like, the point of the article, and then I feel like also the point of this series is that like, I mean, you're putting on a mask then of like kind of, that like you're trying to protect yourself from, like kind of seeing yourself as you really are and stuff like that. You're hiding, like kind of what is and stuff like that. And, like the quote that, comes to mind is, that when, kind of Will finally kind of says to, to Angela, and we'll definitely talk more about, these major characters and stuff like that, is that like, you can't heal under a mask and stuff like that wounds need air. That quote, like kind of, I feel like was like, really wrapped up what this series is about and stuff. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think I have to just sort of say, even if you think this show is over politicized, it's always a very interesting and bold move to sort of say, to reinvent history and say, okay, what would the last 35 years been like had we had, sort of very kind of liberal values in America? We'd had reparations and all these other things. And that for it in itself is a really interesting sort of thought experiment. And so I think there's no other shows that have really done that. So I thought that was a really interesting, and I think it's just really clever that the way they did continue Adrian Veidt's kind of thing that he set up.
Right.
And also I thought reinventing Hooded Justice as, an African-American superhero that used, a lynching noose as his sort of thing. It's one of those things that's so clever that it seems completely obvious when you read the graphic novel now, but it was never explicitly sort of stated. So that was really clever, I thought. I was really impressed with that.
Yeah, and I guess, what we should also mention, though, is that, like, the core story, like, kind of, what it starts off with is this kind of mystery as to why, like, the police chief is hung. Like, even though, like, it starts off with the Tulsa Massacre, stuff like that, but then the other kind of, the more current story is, in the modern times, Don Johnson playing the police chief, Judd is hung and stuff, and then the person who seems like the killer and stuff like that, and again, major spoilers and stuff, is an actor who we know as Gossett Jr. That he's a somebody that's been definitely, like, kind of been around, so to speak, and stuff like that. So that was also a great choice. And then here we have Regina King again, who we briefly mentioned in Mighty Joe Young. And I feel like like, kind of, it's amazing in some ways that, like, that along with the overall kind of story and stuff like that, is that, like, here is these actors who have gone on this journey, and now they've come to the series that like I mean, it's kind of like just if you had to, like, kind of have some work to kind of to rest your laurels on, to kind of like be recognized for your career, I feel like for each of these actors, this is, like, kind of definitely will be one of the kind of key the key jewels in their kind of resumes and stuff.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's funny when I think about Lou Gossett Jr. I always think of Enemy Mine, which is also basically about kind of race as well. But it's it's one of those just comes into my head, similar kind of 80s movie to go with the graphic novel. But it's I mean, the great performances, and then I kind of enjoyed all of them, really. I thought it was a really well done. And I mean, I would say, though, and it doesn't try and tell the story in the same way as the comic. There's less moral complexity, unlike the comic. You don't really know who's good and bad in that. And this one is pretty clear who is a goodie, who's a baddie, except for maybe Don Johnson, and that's about it. They don't really go very far with that. Right. And also, I mean, just like on another sort of TV trope, it's a detective story, Snowpiercer, how can we make this a TV show? Let's make a detective story. And of course, there's the usual sci-fi trope, which is there's a secret mummy or daddy somewhere, that's that needs to be revealed at some point. But I mean, is there any TV show that doesn't do that these days? I think what I liked about it is that whereas I felt the movie lacked the kind of quirkiness and the humor of the original comic, the TV show actually does sort of reintroduce it. The fact that you've got Adrian Veidt living on Europa and is just, sending automatic squid rain down on, these are just really cool things. That's something people might just completely hate. And you can see other people, I've sort of read and watched people's videos criticizing this, but I actually really think that kind of keeps in the spirit of the original in a way, because it subverts your expectations of what you're expecting from a superhero TV show.
And also, I feel like that serves as the pirate story in a very entertaining way, though. Because here he is as like marooned on this, like kind of the moon of Jupiter, something like that. Very much like like kind of in the pirate, story in the original comic and stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think he's been almost updated to be like the removed billionaire in that he's not living in reality. It's almost like a sort of a simulation where he's surrounded by yes men and women, and he's sort of above judgment and could just do whatever he wants, but is completely disconnected from the rest of humanity. I think that's kind of what they're trying to sort of say there. But I mean, he's very different from either the movie or the comic, but he's still entertaining to watch. You can just I just chalk that up to him going mad on Europa and just enjoyed watching Jeremy Irons sort of, eat his way through the scenery. So, but yeah, I mean, the interesting thing though, and this maybe a sort of a subtle subtext here is that, it was his idea to basically make social justice and liberal kind of leaning more widespread, but he's also an incredible narcissist as well.
Right.
So it makes you wonder, is there also this sort of subtle thing of like, being a social justice warrior is kind of narcissistic in the same way as well? I thought that was you can, maybe interpret it that way perhaps.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's overall like kind of what we really see is how they basically took the original graphic novels, key elements, and then like kind of mixed up it in more interesting ways and stuff. Whereas like the original movie like kind of just did like shot by shot, like kind of what was shown in the graphic novel. Here we have like kind of almost like interpretations of the key elements and stuff. Like the alternate history, the somewhat of a kind of underlying mystery, because the whereas the original was the underlying mystery, who's knocking off the superheroes and stuff. Here is like who knocked off the police chief and everything. And meanwhile, I think what's another parallel is that like following that thread is what leads you to the bigger plot that's kind of happening and stuff. And I think that's like kind of what's kind of interesting, how like that's the more essential element that they managed to kind of keep true to in this series and stuff.
Yeah, I in a funny sort of way, I felt it was kind of a little bit disjointed in that I was quite enjoying the reinventing of history and the story of what happened in Tulsa and the hooded justice, and the fact that he'd kind of that rather than in the original comic there's this idea of like your own sort of ego and trauma means that you'd be a terrible superhero. In this, there's more of a message of like you reckon with your trauma and you use that as part of your power in a way. That's sort of what Hooded Justice seemed to do. But also, you can say the same for Laurie Blake's character in that perhaps she's obviously adopted the comedian's surname and has now decided, she is his daughter and has kind of resolved that and has now almost become him in a way for the purpose of this story.
Because
but they're the only ones.
She's definitely a lot more jaded in this.
Totally,
kind of like, and it's interesting because like overall what we have is also like instead of like kind of a remake per se, it's also just like a sequel is really what it is as well, where it's like just continuing on. Like kind of okay, what happens to this Silk Spector that kind of reconciles the fact that like she is who she is, that she's the daughter of this kind of sociopath and stuff, and like kind of if she's coming to terms with that, does she like kind of also have a more jaded view of like kind of nothing ever changes, and like kind of it's all a joke and stuff like that.
Well, I think there's what's the really clever theme about this is this idea. Dr. Manhattan's final thing he says in the comic is that no, Adrian, things don't always end. Or something like that. So, and what you see is this this problem of the psychic trauma from the alien squid attack that's really not been what he really intended for his. He described it as a utopia, and we're pretty far away from that in this. And likewise, you see sort of Laurie Blake is kind of still, wants to go back to Dr. Manhattan after sort of getting rid of him. And and I mean, you kind of get this impression that Veidt is regretful of what he's done, but I don't know. I wouldn't say that's exactly an accurate portrayal of his character, but there is definitely these themes in there.
I think it's also interesting that like in the original movie, we have a more sanitized view that like, there's a nuclear blast and stuff, and things are just kind of vaporized and everything. Whereas in this one, like kind of from the point of view of, Tim Blake Nelson playing, the mirror guy / Looking Glass and everything, we see ground zero, like kind of, like the horror that like kind of, and for that matter, it's interesting how we kind of go back to this idea that we talked about before, that like, some of the best pieces that we've seen have this horror element, and certainly like kind of, seeing, the aftermath of the squid attack, we really see the horrible kind of effect that it had on people and stuff.
Yeah, something that's kind of brushed over in the Snyder movie, actually, because you don't really see any of the devastation at all.
No.
But yeah, I mean, I think Looking Glass for me was one of the characters who most kind of ties into the original comic, in that he's pretty neurotic. He lives in a bunker, and he can't really, he can't seem to like hold a relationship together. But he does have this kind of, practiced or innate skill of being able to tell when people are lying or not. But that episode was probably one of the best ones, actually. I really enjoyed him. One thing I did notice for all of the good guy kind of heroes who weren't real heroes was that I couldn't help feeling they expressed the different kind of fears that the US has, because you had like the Russian Red, whatever he was called,
Red Scare.
Red Scare. You had Looking Glass, who was almost like a reflection of society back to it in itself.
Right.
Then you obviously had
the Middle Eastern.
Yeah, whatever she was called, I can't remember now.
Forget,
and then of course you have Regina King's character, who for some reason I can't remember the name of right now.
Angela.
But yes, Angela. Yeah. What's her superhero name though? I've forgotten.
What's it called? I'll join Blake now as well. Sister Knight.
Sister Knight, that's right.
Because she's a crime-fighting nun and stuff.
That's right.
In the video where she got the video in the VHS video store, because it was the 80s, and it was like, kind of, got to give them credit for just the cover art on that. It just totally looks like something from that time period.
That was one of those scenes where I freeze framed it a few times just to look at the cover art of all these fictional 80s things like fog dancing, which I thought was hilarious sort of title for a David Cronenberg movie. But I bet if you bet every single one of those titles and the video things would be really interesting to look at. But I just thought, no, I'm going to be here for like hours if I do that. So, but I thought they were really sort of highly politicized in that respect. And
also, I feel like, you were kind of saying how in the original movie they really didn't do much with the 80s, but here, one of the ththings that was kind of ran through a good chunk of it was this kind of 80s horror music that you swear was like John Carpenter music and stuff.
Yes. It was very reminiscent, actually. John Carpenter,
very much.
Yeah.
And the other one was kind of like, it's funny how like it would kind of continue the thread, so to speak, right, was using Nine Inch Nails, and with having like kind of this more driving, music that almost felt like it kind of connected a little bit of like kind of, from that time period to like now and stuff. That like, like when they had like certain scenes with Looking Glass and stuff, that when he's interrogating that, like, and it totally fit the moment to have, like kind of this Nine Inch Nails, because the scenes that was shown, it almost felt like you were watching a Nine Inch Nails music video and stuff.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I did like about this, in that very much sort of keeps in terms of theme of the original, was the structure of it. Even though it's Damon Lindelof and you have characters, you're seeing them jumping about in time. Yeah. Which was the key element with Dr. Manhattan's character in the original. And that was what was really interesting about the structure, was this idea that you could jump from one time to another, one place to another. And for me, I felt like the reinvention of nostalgia, rather than just as a sort of a superficial perfume, but as a drug that kind of allows you to visit other people's memories.
Yeah, that was brilliant.
was a really interesting idea, and it brought a lot of that structure of Dr. Manhattan in the comic to Angela's character.
Right.
And that was really interesting, the way you could blend these two time periods, and she could, and it was this weird sort of hereditary genetic reliving of trauma, and making it sort of understanding this character, but also understanding the story of the place and the sort of things that had happened. And it was really clever, I thought.
It made you appreciate the connection between her and what's called Luke Gossett Jr. as the
Reeves,
the grandfather.
Will Reeves,
because they both wore like kind of not only a mask, but also like kind of painted their eyes and stuff. So that was like kind of just, you really see the point of that, and like and whereas it's just really a very visual way showing the connection of this kind of trauma over generations and stuff.
Absolutely. And I mean, the whole sort of theme of genetic trauma was one that was really interesting in it. And this is one that's, it's a bit of it's still a kind of, I think, of sort of a fringe theory, but this idea that you can inherit the trauma of your predecessors through your DNA is quite an out there thing. And that is, with their drug nostalgia, you're getting blood transfusion that helps you deal with the memories of your ancestors, basically.
Yeah.
And why this is, although this is one of those things that, like, is it actually possible? Certainly I don't think it's possible to put people's memories into a drug that you take. But, there is, when you start talking about trauma or memories impacting actual genetic code and cells, you're getting into a very sort of woo-like territory that a lot of scientists don't like, but I actually think is really interesting. Yeah. This is the idea that cells and DNA can actually be influenced by information from outside, external, which then starts to sort of raise the questions: does consciousness come from inside the body or outside the body? Where are these information fields coming from?
Right.
Because, I think DNA can only, there's about 75% of hereditary factors that can't be explained through DNA, apparently. So where does the rest of it come from? So these are all kind of like interesting things that come up through when you start looking at how genetic, is there such a thing as genetic trauma, and is it invented? If people are more interested, Bruce Lipton has a whole kind of, that's his whole thing, is like cells are influenced from outside the body rather than solely, or not just DNA, but a combination of both. So,
yeah,
not popular.
I definitely agree that, like, it can definitely get out there, and it's kind of where I think, just like you said, just presenting it in this way, though, really made it kind of not only visually interesting, but story-wise, it kind of really helped to, like, kind of show, like, kind of the connection. And I feel like, if nothing else, it serves as a metaphor for the fact that, like, regardless of, like, kind of, like, kind of the more woo aspect of it, let's face it, like, kind of, like it's a metaphor for the fact that, like, the current generations are paying the price of what was done to the previous ones. I mean, that's really what it comes down to as well. Like, that, in other words, if you want to just argue, to your blue about kind of the woo aspect, it's like, you and I have kind of also talked offline about, like, kind of, the price of redlining, and how, like,
oh, totally,
the wealth of kind of the these Black communities and stuff, how it's been affected by the fact that, like, basically, they weren't able to get loans early on stuff. And then after that, kind of, the loans, the sham loans that they've got with these contract deals and stuff, where basically it was basically leasing that, like, if they at all missed a payment or, slipped in any way, something like that, they, anything that was put into it was lost. Like, I mean, on and on, like, kind of just ridiculous kind of, things that were done that now we kind of, recognize that, like, how could this be and stuff. But again, like, it goes back to that, like, it's very much like just things that we'd rather not talk about, because it's really uncomfortable to kind of be, again, just to recognize that, like, we've really, like, we as modern society have kind of benefited from these people who have done just horrendous kind of things.
Yeah. No, I mean, regardless of energy fields and DNA, there's enough concrete trauma of real, factual events to make all of this, definitely something that needs to be talked about. I mean, I sort of also, what was I going to say? Sorry, my train of thought's gone now. So, but I mean, I think I wanted to get back one thing. Oh, that's it. Talking about uncomfortable subjects. There is this whole, like, Alan Moore was quoted as saying that he doesn't, this obsession that America has with superheroes. Why did all the superheroes come out of the States? And he's been sort of quoted as saying he actually views the first masked superheroes as the Ku Klux Klan. Oh. And that was something that kind of just got passed down but got reinvented many different times. Right. And I think this, we get back to the masks and how they're used, because it's a very kind of heavy theme in this, and it's really, really interesting for me the way they kind of, I mean, there's the quote, which was, when a white man wears a mask, he's a hero, and when a black man wears it, he's a criminal. I mean, that's it comes into sort of hoodies and things like this, and so I thought that was a really interesting theme for them to go on, and they explored it in lots of different ways as well, in terms of I think the original idea of a mask is probably from religious rituals, right? You wear a mask to transform yourself to some sort of connection.